Welcome, everybody, to Radicalized Truth Survives, episode 120. We are bringing back our very good friend, Dr. Nancy MacLean. She, of course, is the author of Democracy in Chains. We have not talked to Nancy since the calamitous events of November 5th, 2024, but she has some incredible suggestions and ideas on how we can unchain our democracy from these billionaires that are actually trying to murder our world. Have a listen. Nancy MacLean, we are so grateful to have you back with us. You were our 17th episode, and that was more than 100 podcasts ago. I was telling the guys earlier, I've been kind of feasting off that interview for a couple of years now, because there were so many things that you said, primarily that we need to preserve this democracy so we can get to the deep structural reforms that are so necessary. And I have repeated that like a mantra. That is not our story. We are not meeting under those circumstances. But I just have a quick starter question with you. I have been, 'tis the season for me to be watching and reading a lot of Charles Dickens with this very broken heart of mine. But in it, the character Marley talks about the chains that he forged in life. And you chose Democracy in Chains as the title of your incredibly important book, which we're going to talk about. But why did you choose that metaphor? Because I feel like if we'd only listened, if more people would just have read books, we might not be on this precipice.
Thank you. It's great to be with you. Thank you for that question, Heidi, and really wonderful to be back with you, although, as we all wish, we'd have preferred other circumstances. So yes, I'm getting notes like that from readers, old and new, who are saying, we wish more people had listened. But anyway, here we are. I actually chose that title because it was pretty close to words used by one of my subjects in Democracy in Chains, James McGill Buchanan, who was the first U.S. Southerner to win the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences. If you haven't heard of him, don't feel bad. I had not heard of him when I started digging into this story, but later learned how important he was. But basically, he was a quite, in some ways, original thinker about democracy. Unfortunately, he mainly thought it was a bad idea, at least as practice over the course of the 20th century and into the 21st. He died in 2013. But he regularly spoke of the need to, as he put it, enchain the Leviathan, speaking of the federal government, but also at one point talked about how we could not expect the people to make wise decisions since the demos had been unchained with universal suffrage. So of course, the demos being, Greek for the people. So it wasn't really a leap for me to talk about Democracy in Chains, because that's exactly where James Buchanan and the most consequential person who listened to him, Charles Koch, decided we needed to go. And in fact, not just in the US, but globally, the unchaining of democracy.
Incredible. And for those who we've become a book club since you last saw us. I mean, every week we are interviewing authors, and I believe the secret to, or not the secret, the sorrow to where we are is that people don't read books, and they have allowed this fictional reality to take root. And we here compare very much what's happened in America recently to 1990s Russia, where the oligarchs are running the politicians. And you warned about that. You warned about the money. You warned about the GOP no longer existing and now becoming this new thing, this MAGA thing. And can you please, for our friends who may not have read the most recent edition, sort of give us a summary of your very important new preface?
Yeah. So I just want to say too, I so agree with you on the need to read books, and the wonder of the books that have been published in recent years. I mean, there are just so many brilliant, revelatory works that help us understand what we're up against, and yet, most people are on a most people are overwhelmed, I think, with their lives, but also, now relying so much on short take social media, and other forms, and not getting kind of the deep dive that we need to understand how we got here. Anyway, so the new preface to the 2020, and it looks like the same book, has the same ISBN, et cetera, but you can tell it's the new one because it says updated with a new preface on the back. But that preface looked at what had happened after 2017 when Democracy in Chains first came out. And I was really, sending it back to the publisher soon after the inauguration. So before even the, airport protests with the Muslim travel ban and things like that. So anyway, the new preface looks at the relationship between the Koch network and Trump, a story that the mainstream media, legacy media, just really dropped. It's like children watching television. It's like, oh no, we're on a new channel now. It's just this singular individual, Donald Trump. So the new preface looked at that relationship, and I can dig into that a little bit more if you'd like. But also, most of the new preface is devoted to alerting people that we are quite likely to face a constitutional convention in 2025, now that this radicalized MAGA Republican Party has gotten control not only of the White House, but also of both houses of Congress. They are likely to call an Article 5 constitutional convention. And so the new preface talks about what that means, where it is, how it's anchored in the Constitution's Article 5, but even though we've never had one, that possibility is there. It talks about how that came to be in the Constitution, and also how the Koch-funded right and Christian nationalist allies have been pushing for this since 2013, with the American Legislative Exchange Council in the lead, but other partners to this alliance, including Trump's allies in the America First policy and such, pushing for this constitutional convention. So again, that's something that is nowhere in the discussion for the most part among legacy media, although some great journalists and organizations such as the Center for Media and Democracy and Common Cause have written about it. It's not getting the attention that it needs. So quite likely we won't be prepared for it when it is called.
Yeah, that is one of the scariest things that nobody is aware of, right? Is that they can just rewrite the Constitution in any way they want. And, as people sort of misunderstand Christian nationalist as, oh, we're Christian and we're nationalists. No, it means we want a Christian nation, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's
Which
not
is
about
literally,
Christians who happen to be patriots. It's about
no,
people who want to impose their dogma on every institution of our
yes.
society, including the Constitution and the federal government.
Exactly. And the first 10 words of the Bill of Rights are the Establishment Clause for a reason. And they want to, eliminate that, in my view. And I think this is clearly the easiest way for them to do it. I have so many questions. The Supreme Court also obviously factors in here because we've got a backup there. But I've become interested, and we were talking a little bit about this before, and sort of even one step back from Charles Koch, right, to Fred, and the John Birch Society, which came from the America First Committee and all of that. I'm just curious what are your impressions on kind of how that conspiratorial, they used to call it the paranoid mindset, um, how that factors into where we are today.
Yeah. Well, I think the conspiratorial mindset is something that the architects, the multi-billionaire architects of the shackling of our democracy, count on in order to herd voters, right, and develop their base, while the multi-billionaire architects have other things in mind, like absolutely preventing us from taking any action on climate change, even though their own scientists tell them that it's happening, and even though Koch Industries, we've learned from some great research by Connor Gibson and a colleague at the Climate Social Science Network. They were actually getting accurate at Koch Industries, now Koch Inc., they were getting accurate information about climate change and impending climate collapse, and we're actually hedging on that. We're making money on short-term climate changes going, in the 90s and after, while they were, investing huge amounts in climate denial for the rest of us. So I think that almost captures their, how this all works. But so the John Birch Society connection is also really important because, people today, if they've heard of the John Birch Society at all, they know it for its vehement, paranoid anti-communism. So the allegation, for example, that the Republican president and General Dwight Eisenhower was a communist and that the Supreme Court that brought the Brown decision was filled with communists, like that was a little too far for some.
Fluoride also is a communist plot, right? Fluoride?
Yes,
RFK
that's true.
is
That's
also
coming
against
back.
that.
Yeah. But the other thing, though, too, that's very important to know about the John Birch Society is that it did have the extreme libertarian economics, right? They were selling the books of figures like Ludwig von Mises and Hayek and Charles Koch when he was, I guess, in his 20s or so, when he was still in the John Birch Society. It was reputed that he would take people in the bookstore over to the economics section where the stuff he liked was, right? So there is a deep connection there, but this desire to use disinformation as a strategy, to mobilize the base and to get people in the base to support Republican, this radicalized Republican Party of elected officials and support climate change denial and so forth and so on. That has been deeply a part of this billionaire strategy, for quite some time now.
You keep using the word billionaire.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't help but think that if anyone has been paying any sort of attention by now, if they've read your work, if they've seen what's going on, if they see Harlan Crow and Clarence Thomas, if they see Elon Musk and Donald Trump, if they see Peter Thiel and the Republican Party, etc., why is our government allowing these billionaires to engage in a conspiracy to overthrow our country? Why have they not been stopped?
Well, that's a good question. I think partly because we don't actually have the guardrails that we should. I mean, one of the hopes with the election of Joe Biden in 2020 was that it would enable us to do serious structural democracy reform to address some of these problems. And it's almost, possible now to forget how close we came. It was just the votes of Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema in the Senate that blocked that from happening. And granted that, the democracy reform might have not have been as aggressive or as thoroughgoing as some of us would have hoped, but it was a good start in the right direction, and that was blocked. And now we're screwed, for want of a more sophisticated word. Also, to go back and use the billionaires phrase again, they have been working for a very long time. I keep mentioning Charles Koch because he has been in this game the longest, it's like 60 years now, and also invested a huge amount and been very strategic about it. But one of the things they were determined to do was get control of, what we could call the justice function, right? The law school, shaping curriculum in law school to affect understanding of the Constitution, trying to capture figures in the federal judiciary and above all the Supreme Court, and waging litigation that brought some of the court decisions that have helped put democracy in chains. So Citizens United, they pushed for Shelby County, which enabled mass voter suppression, the cases that enabled gerrymandering, of course, undermining regulation with Lopez. I mean, you could go on, but there has been donor effort behind all of these things. And as you say, with the relationship between Harlan Crow and Clarence Thomas, let alone, Leonard Leo playing with one $0.5 billion to invest in these efforts. What are mere mortals to do in the face of that when the captured majority on the Supreme Court has said that it's perfectly fine to use money as speech, including dark, untraceable money. So, we have quite a challenge ahead. I mean, I don't think, by any stretch, it's impossible to meet, but I think we need to be informing ourselves and thinking much more strategically than many folks on the progressive side or Democratic voters have been for quite some time. But I do take heart, just to introduce a different note here. I do take heart from what we just saw in South Korea,
Yeah.
where the president tried to he did declare
Yeah.
martial law, and the people
Yeah.
just said, "Oh no,"
Yeah.
including
Yeah.
many people who were older, who went back to the days of the dictatorship, and they're just like, "No, you're not getting away with this," and they came out on the streets en masse, and he had to back up. So, I do think that one of the things that has always helped progressive forces to advance in the United States, going back to the days of the fight against slavery, was that the propertied elite, the anti-democratic elite, will always overstep, right?
Yeah.
And misuse its power. And those are the moments that people have to be ready for, to use to the fullest in order to expose them, take away their power, and build alternative power centers. So that's something I think we should all be prepared for going forward. Is, of course, they will overstep. They've already overstepped, and Matt
Yeah.
Gaetz, that's a good sign that Matt Gaetz was knocked out of competition so early on. So, we'll see how it goes, but it's going to be quite a turbulent ride in 2025.
Absolutely. I think always of that haunting line from Ernest Hemingway, gradually, then suddenly, gradually, then suddenly. We're in the suddenly portion of this. Along with contemporary books, I read a lot of books from history, and I've been mining this book called Undercover about an American author who went, Armenian American reporter, who went undercover in the Nazi movement in the 30s and 40s. And there's a couple things that I would love for you to address or reflect on. One is that the people that he got to know who were leading the noisy mob against, communism, against this, all in this sort of Christian supremacy, narrative. In private, they would tell this reporter that they didn't believe it, that they weren't anti-Semitic, that they just needed this mob to mobilize. So that's like one piece of it, that they will use these lies and this hatred and this othering and this fear as just bait to get people to fall in line to whatever it is they want to do. The second piece of it is that we used to, at one point in time, take Nazis, real Nazis, and strip them of citizenship, deport them, incarcerate them. There was a brief flicker of time where it appeared that we actually dealt with people who were trying to overthrow democracy. So we've seen all of this before. You have written about how strategic and cynical this is, how the goal was to remove the guardrails so democracy wouldn't get in the way of capitalism. And just from the richness of your experience, is there anything you can tell people about how they're cynically manipulated and how America has to do a better job at dealing with treason?
Yeah. Let me share maybe a piece from the new preface that shows the cynicism about using these reactionary populist leaders. Back in the 1970s, there was a very smart, very interesting libertarian thinker named Murray Rothbard that Charles Koch was patronizing. And Murray Rothbard wrote back at the time, and he was, of course, friends with Roy Cohn and supported Roy Cohn and McCarthy, not because he believed some of the crazy things they believed, but because he thought they could be a battering ram against federal power. So while Murray Rothbard was working with Charles Koch, he wrote, and I'll just say, about the need for what he called a populist reset, right? And thank Donald Trump as I read this. So Rothbard had explained how libertarianism could benefit from an alliance with a populist leader. The reasoning was straightforward. Libertarian ideas would never, on their own, he knew, win over the support of the majority of Americans and were downright anathema to those in power, none of whom, at the time, at least at the time, unlike today, were in any way financially beholden to the libertarian movement. Now listen up. Okay, that's context. But by riding on the coattails of a figure who could, quote, appeal directly to the masses, emotionally, even demagogically, over the heads of the establishment, end quote, they could get to places they could never get on their own. Such a person could best, in Rothbard's words, quote, the Ivy League, the mass media, the liberal intellectuals, and the Republican Democratic political party structure. But not just any populace would do. To achieve its goals, the cause needed, and again, here I'm channeling Murray Rothbard, the cause needed someone with audacity, with a genuine talent for the whipping up of populist emotions, because that is what it would take to smash through established norms. you know, so here is where we are. This is not a new idea for these guys. And in fact, I've, since Democracy in Chains was published, I've started working on the international apparatus of all of this, something called the Atlas Network, heavily funded by US
Good.
libertarian billionaires, but that, so it was involved in Brexit, in the Bolsonaro race, in Modi's India, et cetera. But also I learned that its first politician that it backed with this kind of reactionary populism, if you don't count kind of Thatcher and Reagan, their appreciation of them, was Silvio Berlusconi
Yes.
in Italy in the 1990s, right? So this, it's new to us to realize these connections, but they've been trucking with these reactionary populist figures for a long time because, again, particularly in an age of media fracture, of the, as Sarah Kendzior says, just when real news went behind paywalls,
Yeah.
the slime has become free and readily available. So they're kind of counting on those mechanisms to keep the base inflamed, to keep the kind of tribal agitation up that happens with Fox News and Sinclair Broadcasting and Clear Channel and all of those things, while they're actually moving this deep political economic agenda that will, if it continues, lead to ecological collapse, let alone all kinds of other destruction. So, yeah, and frankly, at this point, not just not only should they be prosecuted as traitors, I think, but also for, frankly, mass murder or at
Yeah.
least manslaughter. I mean, if you look at the impact, we were talking earlier before we got on about the hurricane that happened in the North Carolina mountains, like whatever, nobody had insurance for that because it's never happened, right? A hurricane in the mountains. But, when you look at things like that these guys knew, going back to like 1959, they were
Yeah.
getting their first reports of how destructive climate change would be. And rather than shifting to other kinds of safer energy models, no, they invested more and they disinformed people. So I am glad that there are trials now coming in Minnesota and North Carolina and other places against fossil fuel corporations that inflicted this damage and hurt people. But you're absolutely right. I mean, this captured Republican Party, for years was accusing liberals of treason. If you remember Ann Coulter, who knows what happened to her? She's gone away. But I remember she had a particular book called Treason. And, all those years of saying that, but these are the people who are actually engaging in treason. So like you, I wish that we could see prosecutions for that. We had essentially a judicial coup before the November election. And what I mean by that is, with the Supreme Court sitting on the cases against Donald Trump until it was too late to try him, they enabled his reelection. If he had faced what he should have faced, which is the criminal prosecution for the attack on our country and summoning of that mob, as the congressional hearings showed, we would not be where we are today. We would be in a very different place. So,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you
Just
so
so
much
many
for that.
threads to this too. Yeah.
I can't take notes fast enough. Tribal agitation. What a great contribution, because we need better words as we move
Mhm.
forward. And on that note, Tim Snyder tweeted out yesterday, I think kid killer is the term we need here. The people who stop vaccinations kill our kids. He's
Wow.
basically saying, forget vaccine skeptics, forget anti
Yeah.
vaxxers. And talking about mass murder is absolutely 100% correct. We had Trump leading an anti science brigade
Yeah.
during a global pandemic. So we have a few minutes left, and I have another question I'd like to ask, but I'd like to give Jim and Hi-Fi an opportunity if you have anything else you'd like to follow up with before we finish this brilliant interview off. Yes, go ahead, Nancy.
I just want to add one thing to your point about kid killer, and I haven't seen that, but I'm very glad, and I think that Tim Snyder said that, because I really think we need to speak much more boldly, right, and
Yeah,
call things by their proper names, and I think that is an apt phrase, and even before appointing the nut, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's been
yeah,
denounced by his entire family, who had a worm eat half his brain. I mean, you just can't even say enough crazy about this guy. But even before that, Project 2025, one of its elements was to prevent the Centers for Disease Control from doing any, even suggesting uh, vaccines or masks or other things in a pandemic. So even without, Trump's current crazy, the whole right wing echo chamber of Heritage Foundation and the over 100 organizations that supported Project 2025, they were already, you could say, engaging in premeditated kid killing, with denying the ability to mandate vaccines, which we've been doing in this country since the eradication of polio, right? So yeah, but let me use that to say something a little bit more forward looking too, which is, and not just condemning what's happening, but thinking about where we're going and where the openings for sanity and decency and rebuilding collective power will be. The right will always overstep. They're overstepping in these things. They're overstepping in trying to undermine public education. There's overstepping in so many places, but I think it'll be very important for progressives to be highly strategic, because there's going to be so much provocation come January. It's going to
yeah,
be like a fire hose every day of outrageousness. But where they are structurally changing things that millions of people depend on, support, believe in, and want, that's where the mobilizations should occur, right? So the attacks on public education, the attacks on public health, the attacks on employment, the attacks on Social Security and Medicare. We know all those things are going to come. It's going to be incumbent on us not to spend all our time letting them bait us into outrage about tweets, which only helps Donald Trump
yeah.
solidify that base, but instead trying to open wedges that bring light between him and his followers to say, you didn't vote for this, you don't want that agenda, that's not what you wanted, that's not what you need. And so try to have those conversations.
Thank you. I'm 100% sure that MAGA didn't know it voted for an organized crime ring. Jim.
Yeah,
Just
nicely put, Heidi.
to follow up on that, the you mentioned Sarah Kendzior, who also said that she was worried that Joe Biden's presidency was going to be just basically a transition into another Trump term, which is what happened effectively. And honestly, I think the political process in general, I think, has been exposed as deeply corrupt, and it's
Yeah,
not just on the Republican side. I think the fact that we went through 4 years and managed to not prosecute any of these
yeah,
people cannot just be laid at the feet of the Supreme Court, cannot
yeah.
just be laid, on one side or the other. In
Mhm.
my view, the political process in general has become corrupt. It's not to say we should throw it entirely out. But what I am saying is, it seems to me that we need to organize, as you were saying,
Mhm.
to focus in on these issues that wedge, right? but we need to somehow do it outside of the political process that allowed us to get into this situation to begin with,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So I just wanted to get any of your thoughts
Hmm.
and insights in how we can do that. And I don't mean to say that we should reject the Democratic Party or any of that,
Hmm.
but how do we put pressure on them to use the right words, to
Hmm.
say kid
Yes.
killer instead
Yes.
of vaccine skeptic,
Yeah.
to actually speak to the people that are being hurt
Yeah.
instead of sitting in this establishment alternate reality where it's all just politics.
Yeah.
Thank you for that, Jim. That is so, so, so very important. And I want to recommend a book and another author you might want to speak to, Sarah Chase, who is the author of Thieves of State, about the problem of corruption on a world scale, leading to,
Ooh.
all kinds of upheaval. But in a later book on corruption, which I believe came out about 2019, 2020, it was during the pandemic that it came out, unfortunately, but she brings that analysis home and looks at kleptocratic networks, as she calls them, that operate in throughout these systems, right? Where billionaires have been able to do whatever they want and buy people and so forth. So her work, I think, is really essential for this moment. And I think she'd be very good to talk to. She also had a terrific piece on the election a few days afterwards called This Is What Calamity Looks Like. People could just Google that and find it, but I think
Okay.
very, very illuminating, and said essentially what, the kind of along the lines of what Sarah Kendzior was saying, that we all know that Biden had said he was going to be a transitional president, there was going to be a new generation of leadership, and then didn't want to go, right? And to a lot of ordinary people, it was just like, no. This is the system perpetuating itself. These are the people who didn't do anything, serious enough to meet the suffering that, 60% of our country lives paycheck to paycheck, right? Suffering from insurance. I mean, we could even talk about the United Healthcare thing, right?
Yeah.
And how that's opened the lid on just the popular rage of people just trying to get their health needs met in this society. And as long as these big lobbyists, from the health insurance companies, from big pharma, from, are giving to both parties, we're going to face these problems. And we also have an especially deep structural problem right now, which is that money in politics has long been the bane of democracy, right?
Yeah.
In our society. So it's something, that exists and that is problematic, that has gotten worse with the increasing inequality and the capacity of billionaires of all kinds to put money into politics. But now it's particularly bad because on the right, you have the Charles Kochs and the Elon Musk and the Richard Ulanes and all of those, bad actors getting the Republican Party to do their bidding with primary challenges and so forth. But on the Democratic side, since Citizens United, the Democratic Party isn't competitive unless it gets money. And
Yeah.
when you want to get money from billionaires, you don't want to talk about labor rights. You don't want to talk
Right.
fact that real wages have not gone up significantly since forever. You don't want to talk about how awful and broken our healthcare system is. So these are very, very deep problems. And I think what you're suggesting, Jim, is just hugely important going forward, that the lesson of this election, or one of the lessons, there's many, but one of the key lessons is to rebuild sources of popular power independent of the Democratic Party so that they can be a counterforce to the billionaires who don't want to talk about any of the changes that need to be made. And if we don't do that, then shame on us, because we will never be able to change the agenda. So I think, that point that you raise is just hugely important. That, I keep thinking of the Leonard Cohen song lately. The song about everybody knows that the game is fixed. Everybody knows, people should look up the lyrics to that. That is just such a brilliant song. And actually, Sarah Chase said she wanted to make the title of her book on corruption "Everybody Knows" and used
Yeah.
it as the epigraph, but I guess her publishers got
Brilliant.
away. But I mean, everybody does know, and unless we start
Yeah.
calling things by their proper name, we won't be able to fix this.
Right. Thank you so much for that. Snap, snap, snap. We have been doing our show to try to expose the fact that people are being radicalized en masse, that we have not acknowledged the seriousness of the information war. And here we are, like I said earlier, where people voted for an organized crime ring without their consent. They didn't know. I have another question, but High Fidelity, any final thoughts or a question from you?
I think about what we've been talking about and what the future holds under these. All I can assume is they're mentally ill. They have a hoarding problem. They need to hoard money.
Hmm.
They're sociopaths. They're psychopaths. It feels like billionaires are trying to murder the future so they can get another dollar.
Yeah.
What are your
Wow.
thoughts on that?
Yeah,
Wow.
that was a pithy version of one of the most important questions
That,
we face. I
that's his
can tell
area of
you,
expertise.
yeah, I can tell you by way of preface to my answer that I am a board member of an organization called the Excessive Wealth Disorder Institute. So I could not agree
Wow.
more. You know, this
Can I
is
get a
Wow.
membership card? Can I get a membership
yeah,
card?
but this is another place, right, where we have to start changing the language we use because you're exactly right. It is a disorder. These people are sick. I mean, literally, can you imagine? Like, here you are. I know Charles Koch the best, but you have over $50 billion, right? Over 50, like you can't even, who could spend that? You can't even do anything. But at this point, you have to assume that their brain circuits, right, are so distorted from the years of the adrenaline rushes of getting to that amount of wealth, like Elon Musk, or these other people. And they're getting more and more crazy because they just want to keep going back and sucking more wealth out. And for me, as a US historian, the best analogy that I can think of is the enslavers, right? Who brought on the
Mhm.
Civil War, going back to your point, Heidi, about treason and traitors. The militant enslavers of the South, excited by people like John C. Calhoun. John C.
Yes.
Calhoun, who said on the Senate floor that slavery is a positive good
Yeah.
as an answer to abolitionist organizing and agitation. John C. Calhoun envisioned this whole system, this kind of anti-democratic system that was later picked up by James Buchanan that I wrote about and Charles Koch. But so they understood that the biggest plantation owners, the people who made the most money from trading in men, women, and children, who were in bondage, that they treated as property, they understood that in a republic, in a place where there was popular, we the people were supposed to be in control, that system could not last, right? That democracy was going to come after that system, which it began to do. And so that is why they seceded from the Union, to be able to continue their highly profitable and absolutely disgusting enterprise, right? They're morally reprobate, I mean, like there's so many words you could use for what they were doing, which we could also repurpose for fossil fuels, right?
Yes.
That same drive that you're talking about, where the most crazy luxury is never enough, right? If you own 400 people, you want to own 600. If you have, you know what I mean. I mean, I'm just
Yes.
ranting now, but your point is really important, in that we have to start recognizing there's something wrong with these people, right?
Yeah.
Like, they are not figures to be emulated. They are figures to be controlled for the survival and the well-being of the rest of us. I also like the phrase and I can't remember who I got it from, but our capitalist overlords. I think
Yeah.
that's a good one, But these people are riding us, right? They've got the saddle on, they've got now the spurs and the reins. And the question is, are we going to overthrow them, or are we going to let them ride us into perdition?
We need to overthrow them. We talk a lot here. They're driving us toward a feudalism
Yes.
during a time of global warming, and they think they're going to hang out in their bunkers while we perish. No, Nancy MacLean. I'm so grateful. My mind is so blown. We just are. I've learned so much, and I just want to end with this. We had Marcy Shore on last week. She gave us many beautiful things. She wrote the book, The Ukrainian Night, which is an incredibly poetic look at the primarily the revolution of dignity, where old and young came together to throw out a corrupt gangster who was working for the capitalist overlords. And she said two things that were incredibly important to me. One is she gave us a Polish aphorism where she described just when you think things couldn't get any worse and you've hit bottom, you hear knocking from below. and I feel as if we are at the knocking from below portion of this. She also said, when Jim asked her parallels between 2014 and Ukraine and 2024 America, and she said that she is terrified and that she feels like it's the vindication of the alarmist catastrophist. And we have been saying this for so long here on the show, and you with your work, that this is coming. And is there anything you can leave our viewers with that can be the counter offensive to that? What do we need to do today with this time that we have in order to actually not allow these capitalist overlords to destroy our future, as High Fidelity was saying, have billionaires kill our future?
Yeah. Yeah, I would also mention M. Gessen, whose work on Russia has been so important. She won the Nobel Prize, the National Book Award in 2017. We're both finalists, but there were all these interviews that happened, and she was asked what were the lessons of her work on Putin's Russia for Americans, and her answer was, "That's easy. Never assume that the worst can't happen." Right. And here
Wow.
we are 7 years later. So, echoing your point about the recent interview you did with Marcy Shore, I guess what I would go back to is something that I've repeatedly told people and audiences that I find to be the most important finding of my work in Democracy in Chains, which is that the architects of this strategy knew, not from the abstract, but from repeated historical experience, that their program was terribly unpopular, that no one, certainly not a majority of people, would ever want to live in the kind of world that people like Charles Koch wanted to bring into being. And if people knew what was coming, they would mobilize and they would stop it. And so I still believe that that informed, organized majority is what we need to overthrow the people who are riding us. And yes, Donald Trump did win one of the narrowest victories in modern American, political history, to get into the White House, partly because of what we've talked about of the problems of the Democratic Party and the ways that it didn't address the issues that so many people were feeling. But, and yes, they have both chambers of Congress. But as we also talked about, so much of that was based on disinformation, right? On radically lying to people and telling them things that weren't true and promising things that they won't deliver, including protecting Social Security and Medicare and more. And so I think it is going to be crucial for folks like us and all the kind of people who listen to your podcast and who have been involved in mobilizing to defend democracy in recent years. It's going to be really important for folks to be ready to answer that, right? To help explain to people what happened, to help explain to those MAGA voters, to provide them an off-ramp to say, no, especially the swing ones who came over at the end, you didn't ask for this, right?
Yes.
And to make sure that those people can become part of the big coalitions we will need to push back on all of this, to get the chance again to do the democracy reform that we need, to do all of the things that vast majorities of the people want, and to protect our planet from these monsters, right? These essentially murderous monsters. Let's just be honest about who these fossil fuel liars are, like Charles Koch, like the folks at Exxon and elsewhere, who funded disinformation while profiting from this deadly industry. So I think we will have our work cut out for us. And I know a lot of us felt a deep gut blow that after everything, it wasn't disqualifying, and that Trump could be elected. And so I sympathize with that. I was down for the count for a while myself, but now I think it's ready to, it's time for, getting ready for redeployment, because we need to be there when the catastrophic cruelties of this incoming administration and Project 2025 start going into effect, let alone their effort to rewrite the Constitution. We need to be there. We need to be providing calm, analysis and explanation for people, and also helping people to organize and mobilize to reverse this madness.
I would feel terrible, though, if we didn't have one just quick soundbite from you, because the 30th anniversary edition of your book, Behind the Mask of Chivalry, just came out, The Making of the Second Ku Klux Klan. There's some lessons in there for people, but is there one departing word? Because we are trying to get MAGA to wake up. We're trying to get them to understand that they've been lied to. They've been pushed into many fake realities. We need them. We need them to come back and join us in the salvation of our country. And I'm guessing there's a lesson in there from you that you could share with us.
Thanks for that, Heidi. Again, many lessons, but I think the most important one to close on, that speaks to your point, that isn't so much in the new preface, but is in the original, is what eventually took down the KKK was what will take down, what did you call them before, the organized crime syndicate about to take over our country?
Organized crime ring. I got that from Jim. We share each other's words all the time in our work.
Okay, so the KKK was America's first Christian nationalist mass movement, right? Also white supremacist, also anti-Semitic, also anti-Catholic, but it was absolutely, it sold itself as white Christian nationalist, as it was going to bring purity, protect children, do all these things. And of course, it was anything but, right? That was like the kind of the gateway drug to get you to the awfulness. But what ended up taking it down most immediately was the corruption of its top leaders, right? That they were an organized crime ring. They were liars. They were hypocrites. Their conduct was outrageous. And when it became exposed, they lost members, right? So I think that is one lesson, to go back and look at that movement and see how it collapsed of its own contradictions, and a lot of determined organizing from the people it had targeted, or from other people who were good people and stood in solidarity with the targets. But that collapsing of its own contradictions, overstepping, corruption, etc., was crucial. So I think that's a good takeaway to realize we're going to have some wind in our sails very soon.
All right, Nancy MacLean. The books are Democracy in Chains and Behind the Mask of Chivalry. Get them, learn, support her work, and thank you so much for being with us here today.
Thank you all for all you do. It's really just such a pleasure to be with you. So look forward to coming episodes with other folks. As we said, there's a lot of good books out there.
That's right.
Incredible. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Bye.